All right, so let's start with the big story that we are tracking on WION at this hour. All eyes are right now on Geneva, where officials from the United States and Russia are currently holding talks to discuss the crisis in Ukraine and also the demand by Moscow for security guarantees along Eastern Europe. Now, the amassing of Russian troops and also equipment near Ukraine's border has caused worries in Kiev and also in the West. Officials on both sides have expressed pessimism about any concrete breakthrough from the US-Russia security talks that are currently underway in Geneva. Now, remember, on Sunday, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov had met with his US counterpart Wendy Sherman for a working dinner and described the 2-hour-long conversation as an extremely difficult one. And right ahead of the talks, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has warned that Russia had to choose between dialogue and confrontation.
That strike, and I'm sure that
There you go. Hello.
Now, Russia has insisted that it has no intention of invading into Ukraine anytime soon. Now, just a day ahead of the talks, a Russian Deputy Foreign Minister said that Moscow has been disappointed by the signals that are coming in from Washington and Brussels. The Russian leader has said that the NATO allies reflect a lack of understanding of what Moscow needs at this point of time. He also reiterated that Russia needs legal and binding guarantees that NATO, which is a military alliance led by the Americans, will not expand any further along Eastern Europe. Now, this is a demand by the Russians which Washington has dismissed and has described it as a bit of a non-starter. According to the Russian news agency RIA, Moscow has vowed to not make any concessions under American pressure on the Ukrainian crisis and has demanded for Western security guarantees. And ahead of the meeting, Biden administration has once again warned that Russia will be slapped with debilitating financial penalties if it goes ahead with the threat to invade into Ukraine. On Friday, the United States and NATO also roundly rejected Russian demands that the alliance should not admit any new members that aspire to join the NATO military alliance. Remember, Ukraine has made it abundantly clear that it would want to be a part of the NATO military alliance.
They want to draw us into a debate about NATO rather than focus on the matter at hand, which is their aggression toward Ukraine. We won't be diverted from that issue, because what's happening in Ukraine is not only about Ukraine. It's part of a broader pattern of destabilizing, dangerous, and often illegal behavior by Moscow as it tries to build a sphere of influence that covers the countries that were once under Soviet dominion and to stop them from realizing their democratic aspirations as fully sovereign, independent nations.
Now, speaking to WION, Ukraine's foreign minister also dismissed Russia's demand for not allowing Ukraine to join NATO. He said that although Ukraine considers Russia's demands as unacceptable and illegitimate, Kiev does not stand against dialogue between Russia and the West. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian troops deployed in the Donetsk region have expressed hope that the current talks between the United States and Russia will actually ease tensions.
Дуже хотілося, щоб це все закінчилось. Вже воно надоїло всім. Розуміємо, що воно має закінчитися в тому випадку, якщо на цих переговорах певним людям поставлять певні умови. Заставлять когось щось зробити, якийсь шаг назад, якийсь помінятися. Дуже думаємо, що все-таки наші партнери, ті, які западні, будуть не тільки нам на словах допомагати.
The talks in Geneva will later be followed by Russia and NATO talks in Brussels and the Organization for Security and Cooperation meet that will take place in Vienna. All right, now to give us more insights as to what can be expected between these talks between the Americans and the Russians that are presently underway in Geneva, we are joined in by Mr. Maximilian Hess, who is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Now, Mr. Hess, thank you very much for joining us on this broadcast on WION. Now, this, of course, is something that is going to be watched very closely around different capitals around the world. Russia and the United States are meeting. The issue at this point of time is, of course, the crisis in Ukraine. And Russia has put forth some very concrete demands from the Americans. It wants NATO to roll back to the situation that existed before 2008. It does not want NATO to expand any further in Eastern Europe. Will the Americans relent to any of these demands?
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I don't expect that the United States will fully agree to those demands. The Russians have put them out as almost a statement of their ultimate desires as a negotiating position, knowing that they are very unlikely to get there. Just before 2008, NATO extended membership action plans at the beginning of that year to Ukraine and Georgia. Russia, ever since, has been very keen to be sure that they would never be enacted. However, it had never had majority support in Ukraine until Russia invaded the country in 2014. Now it has quite strong majority support. So Russia's own foreign policy has, to some extent, been counterproductive.
Now, if the Americans are not willing to give any kind of security assurances to the Russians, then what is it that will be offered to the Russians to try and somehow, in some ways, mollify some of the concerns that the Russians have? Because Ukraine has been pretty strident in its demand of wanting to be included in NATO.
I don't think the United States will give that guarantee. It'll see that as an infringement upon its own treaty rights, as well as the sovereignty of many of Russia's neighbors who are aspirants to join or who have joined, such as the Baltic states. The U.S., however, is likely to be willing to give some concessions to Russia, potentially around recognizing Russia's role as a regional and an international power, reversal from the Obama-era description of Russia as just a local and middling power, or even the Trump era's acknowledgement that Russia was a real power, but refusal to essentially codify that, primarily for domestic reasons in the United States. The Biden administration will have a very tough time making any such agreement. You'd really need a kind of grand bargain on gas issues, not just security, on political interference, on cyberspace. So I think this is potentially a stepping stone towards that, but I would say it is quite unlikely we'll have some grand new security treaty at the end of this week.
All right, that's interesting. It'll be interesting to see as to what kind of security treaty would come forth, if indeed it does. But at this point of time, as things stand, there are over 100,000 Russian soldiers that have been amassed along the border with eastern Ukraine. They've been there since middle of November. Many people were saying that there was a possibility of a Russian military action in Ukraine. How do you see this situation getting diffused?
Well, for Russia, part of its foreign policy strategy with regards to Ukraine has been to essentially assure that that military threat has been there for over 8 years now. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. It continues to occupy the Crimean Peninsula, which it claims it justified through a referendum, but which the international community has not recognized. And it also supports two proxy separatist regimes in the east of the country and continues to supply them with military hardware and has throughout the conflict. Now, Russia, I think, has really escalated the pressure to show the extent to which it is serious about having talks and trying to use the current geopolitical environment to extract concessions from the Biden administration and from the European Union as well. However, I don't think that Russian generals ultimately are desiring to enter Ukraine, at least significantly beyond the front lines of where they are now. If the Ukrainians change, for example, in their use of air power in a way that may affect the strategic balance in the country, I do think the Russians will intervene. Does that mean that I expect the Russians to push well beyond the current territory and towards other major cities such as Kharkov and Kiev? I think it is certainly possible, and they need that threat to be credible, but that is not their intent at this stage, in my opinion.
All right, it'll be very interesting to see as to how these talks, of course, unfold. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Maximilian Hess, for joining us in this broadcast, WION, and giving us your views. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.